They teach you to forget your own name before they teach you how to kill. You grow up believing loyalty is the only truth. Then one day, they order you to kill another version of yourself. Same face, same training, same orders. And you realize the Alpha Legion never needed soldiers. They needed ghosts who would obey without ever knowing why. I learned to forget my name before I learned to kill. They took me when I was young enough that the before barely registers now, a blur of faces and sensations that might belong to someone else entirely. A woman's voice singing something wordless. The smell of cooking grain. Sunlight through a narrow window. These fragments exist in my mind like artifacts from a dead civilization, relics I can observe but never truly possess. The instructors told us that memory was the first weakness. That to remember who you were meant, carrying the weight of a self that no longer served any purpose. They taught us to hollow ourselves out, to become vessels waiting to be filled with whatever identity the mission required. I was good at it, better than most. By the time I reached my 14th year, I could slip into a new name the way others slipped into new clothes, wearing it comfortably until the moment came to discard it entirely. The fortress where they trained us existed somewhere in the void between worlds, a place without designation or record. We were told it moved constantly, phasing through real space, and the warp according to patterns only the highest echelons understood. The walls were bare metal, cold to the touch, and the corridors stretched in configurations that seemed to shift when you weren't looking directly at them. At night, when the artificial day cycle dimmed the lumens to near darkness, you could hear sounds that didn't match any machinery I recognized. Whispers in languages that twisted the ear, footsteps that came from directions that shouldn't exist. The instructors never acknowledged these phenomena, and we learned quickly not to ask questions. Curiosity was another weakness to be excised. My cohort numbered 37 when we began. We were never told where the others came from, though I suspected most were taken from Imperial worlds during raids that officially never happened. The Imperium maintains such meticulous records of its citizens, such careful tallies of tithes and conscriptions, but there are always gaps. Children who vanish during planetary upheavals, orphans from disaster zones. The forgotten and the overlooked, we might have been any of those things. The Legion had been harvesting recruits this way for 10,000 years, perfecting the art of taking without leaving traces, building an army from the spaces between official history. They called me Threx during those years, though I understood even then that the name was temporary. Kale came later, attached to a different identity, a different mission. The instructors rotated constantly, their faces hidden behind featureless helms, their voices modulated into identical monotones. We could never be certain if we were being taught by the same 3 individuals or 300. They drilled us in languages I had never heard spoken, in customs from cultures that might have been extinct for millennia. We learned to move like soldiers from a dozen different regiments, to speak with the accent of planetary governors and underhive gangers alike, to adopt the mannerisms of tech priests and administratum clerks. Every identity was a mask, and beneath each mask was only another mask waiting to be discovered. The physical conditioning was brutal but unremarkable compared to what the Legionis Astartes endure in other chapters. We were not meant to be giants clad in power armor, not meant to be the Emperor's angels of death striding across battlefields with thunder in our steps. We were something else entirely, something smaller, something that could slip through the gaps in the galaxy's armor and strike at the soft flesh beneath. They taught us to fight, certainly, with blade and bolt and bare hands, but the emphasis was always on precision rather than overwhelming force. A knife in the dark, poison in the wine, the whispered word that turned ally against ally. These were our true weapons. I remember the first time they showed us what we were being trained to become. We were gathered in one of the deep chambers, the kind that felt less like architecture and more like a cavity carved into something organic. The walls seemed to pulse faintly, though that might have been a trick of the dim lighting. An instructor whose designation I never learned activated a hololith projector, and images flickered into existence above us. Battlefields across 1,000 worlds. Cities burning, fleets tearing each other apart in the void. And moving through it all, barely visible, were figures in power, armor, the color of deep ocean water, their heraldry shifting and contradictory, their allegiances impossible to determine. Sometimes they fought alongside imperial forces against the horrors of chaos. Sometimes they stood with traitor legions against the Imperium's soldiers. Sometimes they seemed to fight both sides simultaneously, sowing confusion and discord with surgical precision. The instructor let the images play in silence for long minutes before speaking. His voice was different from the others, carrying a weight that suggested actual authority rather than mere pedagogy. He told us that we were being offered a purpose beyond ourselves, beyond any individual life or death. He told us that 10,000 years ago, the galaxy had been set upon a path of slow annihilation, and that only through constant manipulation, through endless covert action and calculated betrayal, could that path be altered. He told us that truth was a luxury the galaxy could not afford, that certainty was the death of adaptability, and that we would be asked to sacrifice not just our lives but our very ability to know whether our sacrifices mattered. Some of the recruits asked questions. They wanted to know which side the Legion truly served. They wanted assurance that despite the apparent chaos, there was an underlying logic, a grand plan that justified the contradictions. The instructor regarded them with what might have been pity behind his featureless helm, then ordered their immediate termination. The servitors came from hidden alcoves, their movements efficient and merciless. The screaming lasted only seconds. The rest of us learned the lesson that was being taught. Doubt was acceptable. Questioning was not. I survived another 4 years of training after that day. The cohort dwindled steadily, lost to failed exercises, failed psychological evaluations, failed demonstrations of loyalty that I suspect were actually demonstrations of excessive loyalty, of too much certainty in any particular direction. By the time we reached the final trials, only 9 of us remained. We were given names that sounded almost real, identities that came with fabricated histories and forged documentation. I became Kyle Threx, a minor functionary in the Administratum's Department of Cartography, seconded to a naval vessel operating in the Segmentum Obscurus. The documentation was perfect, layered with authenticator stamps and cross-references that would survive all but the most intensive scrutiny. I memorized every detail of my false life until it felt more real than the fragments of my actual childhood. They implanted us with the standard augmentations then, the modifications that would allow us to interface with Legion protocols without being full Astartes. Gene seed was too precious and too traceable for operatives like us. Instead, we received synthetic organs grown in hidden laboratories, bio-enhancements that increased our strength and resilience without crossing the threshold into obvious transhuman capability. I could pass for baseline human under casual observation, but my bones were laced with compounds that could withstand impacts that would shatter normal skeletons. My blood carried nanomachines that could neutralize most toxins, and my neural pathways had been rewoven to allow for rapid processing of multiple sensory streams simultaneously. The pain of the surgeries was considerable, but pain was just another form of information, another sensation to be catalogued and filed away. The ship they assigned me to was called the Righteous Pursuit, a lunar-class cruiser with a crew complement of 90,000 souls. I reported aboard as scheduled, my forged credentials accepted without question by the ship's administrative staff. My duties were exactly as mundane as they appeared to be, updating star charts and logging navigational data, the kind of work that required just enough expertise to justify my presence, but not so much that anyone would pay particular attention to me. I shared quarters with 3 other low-level functionaries, played regicide in the crew lounges during off-shifts, attended the chaplain's mandatory prayer services with appropriate displays of devotion. To every observer, I was exactly what I appeared to be, another forgettable cog in the Imperium's vast machinery. The mission protocols arrived through channels I had been taught to monitor, data bursts hidden in routine astropathic traffic, coded sequences embedded in maintenance logs. I would find myself drawn to check certain terminals at certain times, my fingers moving across input keys in patterns that bypassed standard security without triggering any alarms. Messages would appear, brief and encrypted, giving me objectives that seemed disconnected from any larger purpose. Arrange for a specific technician to be reassigned to Engineering Bay 7. Ensure that a particular shipment of ammunition was mislabeled in the inventory logs. Leave a data wafer in a specified junction box on Deck 42. Small things, seemingly meaningless things. I executed each task with perfect precision, never questioning the purpose, never attempting to see the larger pattern. That was not my role. I was a single neuron in a vast distributed intelligence, firing when stimulated, passing signals along without needing to comprehend the thought they contributed to. The Legion had learned long ago that compartmentalization was the ultimate security. If I was captured, if I was interrogated even by the most skilled inquisitors, I could reveal nothing of value because I genuinely knew nothing of value. My actions existed in isolation, disconnected from context or consequence. 6 months into my posting aboard the Righteous Pursuit, the ship responded to a distress call from a mining colony on the edge of the Veiled region. The details were routine enough. A standard obligation under naval protocol. The colony had gone silent 3 weeks prior, and a cursory auger sweep showed life signs, but no responsive communications. The captain authorized a landing party, and I ensured through careful manipulation that I was included in the support staff, my cartography expertise providing plausible justification for my presence. The colony was built into the side of an asteroid, its structures anchored to the rock with massive pylons that had withstood centuries of micrometeorite impacts. As our Aquila lander descended toward the primary docking bay, I could see that the exterior lights were still functioning, that the atmospheric shields were maintaining their integrity. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been a catastrophic systems failure. The landing party consisted of 30 naval armsmen, a junior officer named Lieutenant Vasca who carried himself with the nervous energy of someone desperate to prove himself, and a handful of support personnel, including myself. We cycled through the airlock into an environment that registered as breathable but carried an odor I couldn't immediately identify, something organic and faintly sweet. The colony's interior was intact but abandoned. Personal effects remained where they had been left, half-eaten meals still sitting on tables in the communal dining hall, workstations still active and displaying whatever tasks had been in progress when the evacuation occurred. Except there was no evidence of an evacuation, no signs of struggle, no bodies. The armsmen swept through the corridors with weapons ready, calling out clearances that echoed strangely in the empty spaces. Lieutenant Vasca consulted with his sergeants, his confusion evident. I hung back, observing, waiting for whatever was supposed to happen next. We found the miners in the deep excavation levels, and I understood immediately why the distress call had been sent. They were alive in the most technical sense, their bodies still functioning, their eyes still tracking movement, but their minds had been hollowed out by something that left only screaming emptiness behind. They sat in neat rows in one of the processing chambers, 300 men and women arranged like components awaiting assembly, their mouths open in expressions of terminal horror that their vocal cords could no longer give voice to. The armsmen recoiled, several of them voiding their stomachs. Lieutenant Vasca ordered an immediate withdrawal, his earlier eagerness replaced by pure survival instinct. The mission protocol that activated in my neural implants was simple and absolute. I was to ensure that one specific individual among the afflicted miners was recovered and transported to a designated location. The protocols included visual identification markers and a set of coordinates that corresponded to nothing in the official star charts. I moved through the chamber while the others were distracted by their revulsion, locating the target with practiced efficiency. She was younger than most of the others, perhaps in her mid-20s, with the calloused hands of someone who had spent years working manual extraction equipment. Her eyes tracked my approach with the same empty awareness as the rest, but there was something else there too, something that might have been recognition or might have been a random firing of damaged neurons. I sedated her with a compound from my medkit, then claimed to Lieutenant Vasca that I had detected faint vital signs that suggested possible recovery. It was a thin justification, but the lieutenant was too overwhelmed to scrutinize my actions closely. We loaded her onto one of the cargo pallets and returned to the lander. leaving the rest of the afflicted to whatever fate awaited them. The Righteous Pursuit's Medicae staff confirmed my fabricated diagnosis, placing the woman in an isolation ward where she would receive treatment that would, according to my forged medical recommendations, require several weeks of specialized care. In reality, she would be retrieved by Legion assets during the ship's next port call, spirited away to serve whatever purpose the mission planners had determined she would fulfill. I never learned what had happened to the miners, what had reduced them to those empty shells. I never learned why that one woman needed to be extracted or what information she carried in her broken mind. These were not questions I was meant to ask. The mission was complete. The protocols deactivated. I returned to my duties, updating star charts and logging navigational data, and the incident faded into the background of shipboard routine like a stone sinking into dark water. The years accumulated without meaning. I was reassigned multiple times, moving between ships and stations and planetary installations according to patterns I neither controlled nor comprehended. Sometimes I maintained my identity as KL Threx. Sometimes I became other people, slipping into their lives with the ease of long practice. A weapons inspector on a forge world, a trade liaison on an agri world, a penitent serving in the lower habs of a hive city. Each identity came with its own history, its own relationships, its own small tragedies and triumphs. I played my roles perfectly, cultivating friendships that were entirely false, expressing emotions I did not feel, building trust that existed only to be exploited when the mission protocols required it. There were moments when I found myself forgetting which identity was the current one, when the accumulated weight of false lives began to blur together into a single continuous fiction. I would be speaking to someone and realize I had almost used the wrong name, almost referenced experiences that belonged to a different mask entirely. The Legion's training had prepared me for this, had taught me meditation techniques and mental compartmentalization strategies, but the human mind was not designed for this kind of existence. Cracks appeared, small ones at first, a dream that mixed elements from multiple identities. A moment of hesitation before responding to my own name, a growing sense that beneath all the masks there might not be anything left at all. I began to wonder, during the long watches when I was alone with my thoughts, what the purpose of it all was. Not the immediate tactical objectives I was given, but the grand strategic vision that supposedly justified 10,000 years of covert operations and carefully orchestrated betrayals. The Legion claimed to serve some higher purpose, some ultimate goal that required maintaining uncertainty and discord throughout the galaxy. But what if there was no grand plan? What if the organization had long ago lost sight of whatever objectives had motivated the original Primarchs, and now continued operating purely through institutional momentum, carrying out missions simply because carrying out missions was what the Legion did? These thoughts were dangerous, I knew. The kind of doubts that the instructors would have identified as pre-indicators of operational compromise. But I also knew that absolute certainty was its own form of blindness, that the Legion's doctrine required maintaining some degree of questioning even about the doctrine itself. It was a paradox that could drive you mad if you examined it too closely. We were taught to doubt everything except our training to doubt everything. We were taught to trust nothing except our ability to function without trust. The contradictions nested within each other like puzzle boxes, and I had long since stopped trying to find the bottom. I was 43 years old, though my augmented biology made me appear a decade younger when they gave me the mission that would change everything. The protocols came through while I was stationed on Veritas Prime, a minor administrative world notable only for its extensive archives of historical records. I had been posing as a junior archivist for nearly 18 months, my duties involving the cataloging of ancient texts and the verification of documentary authenticity. It was mind-numbing work, exactly the kind of position where someone could remain invisible for years without attracting attention. The protocols instructed me to cease all current activities and proceed to a set of coordinates in the Undercity, where I would receive further instructions from a handler I had never worked with before. The Undercity of Veritas Prime was typical of Imperial worlds, a sprawling network of forgotten infrastructure and abandoned habitation zones that existed beneath the functioning surface of civilization. I descended through access tunnels marked with maintenance codes from centuries past, moving through darkness broken only by the glow of bioluminescent fungi that had colonized the ancient walls. The air grew thicker as I descended, heavy with moisture and the smell of decay. I passed through territories claimed by various undercity gangs, their markers painted on walls in languages that predated the current imperial dialects. None of them challenged me. I had adopted the bearing and dress of a mid-level enforcer, the kind of person who moved through these spaces on official business and was best left unmolested. The coordinates led me to a chamber that had once been part of a water reclamation facility, its machinery long since stripped for parts and sold on black markets. A figure waited there, seated on a piece of broken pipe, wearing the nondescript clothing of an undercity dweller. As I approached, he looked up, and I saw his face clearly for the first time. It was like looking into a mirror that showed me as I might have been after decades of harder living. The same bone structure, the same eyes, the same way of holding tension in the shoulders. He could have been my brother, he could have been me. He introduced himself as Kael Threx, and when I started to correct him, to explain that I was Kael Threx, he smiled with an expression that mixed sympathy and bitter understanding. He told me that names were irrelevant, that we were both products of the same process, grown from the same basic template and trained according to the same protocols. He said there were dozens of us scattered throughout the segmentum, maybe hundreds, all carrying variations of the same identity, all executing missions that might support or contradict each other depending on variables we would never be privy to. The Legion had learned that redundancy was essential for long-term operations, that single points of failure were unacceptable. So they had built systems where assets could be replaced seamlessly, where one operative's death or compromise would trigger another to step into the gap without any disruption to the larger plan. He told me this casually, as if describing routine administrative procedures, and perhaps to him it was. I found myself struggling to process the implications, to reconcile this revelation with my understanding of my own existence. If there were dozens of me, hundreds of me, then what did my individual actions matter? What did my individual survival matter? I was not a person. I was a pattern, a template, a reproducible component in a machine I could barely comprehend. The other Kael watched my struggle with knowing eyes, then handed me a data slate containing the mission parameters we would be executing together. The target was a cell of Legion operatives identical to ourselves, another group of Kael Threxes, operating under different handlers, pursuing objectives that had been deemed counterproductive to current strategic priorities. The mission was simple in its brutality. We were to locate them, neutralize them, and ensure that no evidence of their existence remained. It was wet work, the kind of direct violence that seemed to contradict everything I understood about the Legion's operational philosophy. But as the other Kael explained, sometimes subtlety required eliminating the subtle. Sometimes the best way to maintain secrecy was through the liberal application of murder. We spent 3 days preparing, pooling our resources and intelligence, comparing notes on our respective missions, and gradually constructing a picture of the target cell's likely location and capabilities. They were operating out of a mid-level hab complex in the administrative district, posing as trade factors for a merchant combine that existed only on paper. Standard Legion tradecraft. We would have done the same in their position. The other Kael suggested we approach it like any other infiltration, relying on our shared training and shared instincts to coordinate without needing explicit communication. I agreed, though part of me wondered what would happen if our instincts diverged, if the different paths our lives had taken had worn different grooves into our decision-making processes. We hit them in the hours before dawn, when the circadian rhythms of even the most disciplined operatives were at their lowest ebb. The hab complex was secured with standard commercial-grade locks and surveillance systems, easily bypassed with the tools and techniques we had mastered years ago. We moved through the corridors in perfect silence, our augmented senses mapping the space around us, detecting the faint electromagnetic signatures of active monitoring equipment and routing around them. The target cell's safe house was on the 7th floor, disguised as a small import-export office that would withstand cursory investigation but not intensive scrutiny. The door yielded to my lockpicks without resistance. We entered in a smooth, dynamic breach, weapons drawn and targeting solutions already calculated. The interior was exactly what I expected, because it was exactly what I would have arranged in their position. A small front office for appearances, a storage area stocked with legitimate trade goods to support the cover identity, and a hidden rear section accessed through a false wall panel. The other Kyle moved toward the panel while I secured the front area, our coordination effortless and instinctive. The false wall slid open to reveal 3 men sleeping in narrow bunks, their rest so deep that they didn't wake even as we entered. The other Kale raised his weapon, and I did the same, both of us aiming at sleeping faces that mirrored our own, because of course they did. Of course, the target cell consisted of more Kale Threxes, more iterations of the same pattern, more components stamped from the same template. I looked at the man in the first bunk and saw myself as I had been 5 years ago, leaner and harder and carrying an intensity I had gradually worn down through accumulated compromises. I looked at the man in the second bunk and saw myself as I might become in another decade, his face carrying lines that suggested long experience with both violence and regret. The man in the third bunk was looking back at me. His eyes were open, his breathing unchanged, giving no indication of alertness beyond that terrible knowing gaze. He had been awake the entire time, had heard us enter, had assessed the situation, and made the same calculation we would have made in his position. There was no escape, no possible tactical solution. The best he could hope for was to die with dignity rather than struggling pointlessly. He continued to regard me with absolute calm, and I understood in that moment that he had been expecting this, that he had known, perhaps for days or weeks, that termination was coming, that he had made his peace with it. I pulled the trigger. The weapon's report was muffled by the suppressor, but still loud enough in the enclosed space. Loud enough to wake the other 2 targets, who reached for weapons that weren't there because we had already secured the area. The other Kale killed them with efficient headshots, 2 quick double taps that scattered blood and brain matter across the cheap fabric of the bunks. The room filled with the smell of burnt propellant and voided bowels, the degrading reality of death, stripped of any dignity or meaning. We searched the bodies according to protocol, recovering their identification documents and communication devices, cataloging their possessions for later analysis by intelligence specialists who would determine if anything useful could be extracted. I found a data slate in the third man's possession, the one who had been awake, and when I activated it, I found myself looking at mission logs that detailed operations I had never executed, assassinations I had never performed, relationships I had never cultivated, betrayals I had never committed. But the writing style was mine. The thought processes were mine. The meticulous documentation of operational details, the dry factual tone that avoided any emotional investment, the habit of noting small sensory details for later reference. This was my work, executed by someone who was not me but might as well have been. I scrolled through the logs, reading accounts of missions that spanned years, that took this other version of myself across multiple sectors and through dozens of different identities. He had done things I had never imagined, had killed people I had never met, had served objectives that contradicted objectives I had been given, and yet reading his logs felt like reading my own memories, felt like recovering some dissociated segment of my own experience that I had somehow forgotten. The other Kyle, my current partner, watched me reading and said nothing. He had been through this before, I realized. He had killed other versions of himself and read their logs and understood what I was currently understanding. We burned the bodies in a chemical accelerant that reduced them to ash and fragments of bone, then scattered the remains through the Hab complex's waste disposal systems. We sanitized the safe house, removing every trace of the cell's existence, ensuring that any investigation would find nothing beyond evidence of a minor break-in that had yielded nothing of value. The local enforcers would file a routine report and promptly forget about it. Within a week, the landlord would re-rent the space to new tenants who would never know what had happened there. The galaxy would continue spinning, and 3 more Kale Threxes would be gone from it without leaving any mark at all. My partner and I separated after the mission, returning to our respective cover identities without any discussion of what we had done or what it meant. There was nothing to discuss. We had executed our orders. The mission was complete. The protocols had deactivated. Everything was as it should be. Except that I couldn't stop thinking about the data slate, about those mission logs, about the life I had read that was mine but not mine. I had kept it, a violation of operational security protocols, because I couldn't bring myself to destroy it. Though I wasn't sure what. Evidence that I existed, perhaps, or evidence that I didn't exist at all, that I was simply one instance of a recurring pattern, no more individual than a single playing card in an infinite deck. I began to research in the margins of my official duties, using my access to Veritas Prime's archives to search for references to the Alpha Legion that might give me some context for my existence. The official records were sparse and contradictory, as was to be expected. The Alpha Legion had a reputation for inscrutability even among the traitor legions, their allegiances uncertain, their objectives unclear. Some sources claimed they had remained loyal to the Emperor all along, that their apparent betrayal during the heresy had been an elaborate ruse designed to infiltrate the Chaos forces. Other sources insisted they had fallen completely to the ruinous powers, that their apparent loyalty was the true deception. Most sources simply admitted ignorance, noting that the Alpha Legion's operations were so thoroughly compartmentalized that even their own members might not know which side they were truly serving. I found references to the doctrine of the Omegon, the concept that every member of the Legion was simultaneously themselves and everyone else, that individual identity was subordinate to collective purpose. I found tactical analyses suggesting that the Legion operated according to probability matrices so complex that they accounted for every possible outcome, that their missions were designed to shape events regardless of success or failure. I found theological speculation proposing that the Alpha Legion had transcended traditional notions of loyalty and betrayal, that they had become something alien to the Imperium's binary conception of friend and enemy. None of it helped. None of it provided the clarity I was searching for. If anything, it only deepened the uncertainty, only reinforced the sense that I existed in a state of permanent ambiguity, that every action I took served purposes I could not understand and might not support if I did understand them. I was a weapon aimed at targets I could not see by hands I would never meet. The Legion had promised me purpose, but what they had delivered was a void where purpose should have been. I was 57 years old when I received the summons to return to the training fortress. It came without warning or explanation, simply a set of coordinates and a directive to cease all operations and proceed immediately. The journey took weeks, navigating through routes that seemed to fold back on themselves, that took me through regions of space where the stars seemed wrong, and the warp currents ran in directions that made no navigational sense. By the time I arrived, I had lost any sense of where in the galaxy I actually was. The fortress looked exactly as I remembered it, or perhaps it had been rebuilt to match my memories. The cold metal walls, the shifting corridors, the sounds that came from nowhere. I was processed through security by servitors whose faces I recognized but whose names I had never learned, then escorted to a briefing chamber that I was certain I had never seen before but that felt intimately familiar. A dozen others waited there, all men, all roughly my age, all carrying themselves with the particular posture that came from Legion training. I recognized several of them immediately. They were me. More iterations of Kale Threx, summoned from wherever they had been operating for purposes we would soon discover. An instructor entered, one of the faceless figures from my youth, and explained without preamble that we were being reassigned. The missions we had been executing were complete or had been deemed no longer viable. Our current identities were compromised or would soon become compromised. We would be receiving new assignments, new identities, new objectives that would take us into situations of escalating complexity and danger. Some of us would not survive the next decade. That was acceptable and expected. The Legion would continue regardless of individual losses. We existed to serve the greater purpose, whatever that purpose might be. The instructor outlined the new mission parameters, We would be infiltrating an inquisitorial investigation into suspected Alpha Legion activity in the Calixis sector. Our roles would vary depending on our individual capabilities and the needs of the operation, but the overall objective was to ensure that the investigation produced conclusions that supported Legion interests. Which interests specifically, the instructor did not elaborate. Whether we would be steering the investigation toward truth or away from it, toward exposure or toward deeper concealment, remained deliberately unclear. That ambiguity was itself a weapon, the instructor explained. If we did not know the true objectives, we could not betray them even under the most aggressive interrogation. I was assigned the identity of an inquisitorial scribe, a low-level position that would give me access to the investigation's documentation without attracting undue attention. The other Kales received their own assignments, their own roles in the unfolding operation. We were given forged credentials that would survive any scrutiny short of direct psychic probing, implanted with false memories that would support our cover stories, briefed on the personalities and procedures of the inquisitorial conclave we would be infiltrating. It was comprehensive and terrifying in its thoroughness. By the time the briefing concluded, I could barely remember the life I had been living on Veritas Prime. It felt like something that had happened to someone else. Another mask that had been worn and discarded. The investigation was being conducted by Inquisitor Helene Varak, a member of the Ordo Hereticus with a reputation for ruthless efficiency and absolute devotion to the Emperor. She operated out of a fortress monastery on the world of Scintilla, from which she coordinated a network of agents and informants that spanned multiple systems. The suspected Alpha Legion activity she was investigating involved a series of seemingly unrelated incidents, supply chain disruptions and minor rebellions and administrative failures that her analytical staff had identified as potentially following a pattern. She believed that an enemy operative was working to destabilize the sector through subtle manipulation, and she intended to expose and eliminate that operative before the destabilization reached critical mass. I reported to the Fortress Monastery with my forged credentials and was accepted into her staff without question. The vetting process was thorough, but relied on documentation and background checks that the Legion had long since learned to defeat. I was assigned to the documentation department, where my duties involved organizing case files and ensuring that reports were properly catalogued according to inquisitorial standards. It was mind-numbing work that gave me access to everything flowing through the investigation while ensuring that I remained beneath notice. I was furniture. I was wallpaper. I was exactly where I needed to be. The investigation progressed over months, Inquisitor Varak's team gradually assembling evidence that pointed toward Alpha Legion involvement in the sector's troubles. They were correct, of course. The Legion was operating throughout Calixis, executing missions that ranged from simple intelligence gathering to complex political manipulation. What Varak and her people didn't understand was that their investigation itself was part of the operation, that every piece of evidence they uncovered had been carefully positioned to lead them toward conclusions that served Legion interests. We were investigating ourselves, exposing ourselves, condemning ourselves, all according to a plan that existed somewhere beyond our comprehension. I fed information to the investigation according to my mission protocols, ensuring that certain files were prioritized while others were overlooked, that certain witnesses were interviewed while others remained undiscovered. The other Kales operated in their own spheres, one serving as an interrogator specialist, another as a field agent, a third as an analyst in the intelligence division. We never acknowledged each other directly, never communicated in any way that could be traced, but I could see their work in the patterns of the investigation's progress, could recognize their distinctive touches in the way information flowed and conclusions formed. The investigation culminated in a raid on a suspected Legion safe house in Scintilla's Underhive, an operation that Inquisitor Varak personally led with a strike team of experienced stormtroopers. I was not part of the assault force, but I monitored the reports as they came in, watching through tactical data feeds as the team breached the location and engaged the targets within. The gunfight was brief and brutal, the defenders offering only token resistance before being overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. 3 enemy combatants were killed, 2 were captured alive, though badly wounded. I reviewed the after-action reports and the preliminary interrogation transcripts and felt something cold settle in my chest as I recognized the patterns of speech, the thought processes, the particular ways of deflecting questions while appearing to cooperate. The captured operatives were Kael Threxes. More iterations of the same pattern, more components stamped from the same template. They had been positioned in that safe house deliberately, had been set up to be discovered and captured, had been sacrificed to give the investigation a sense of accomplishment and closure. Their interrogations would reveal carefully curated information that would lead Varrock toward new targets, new investigations, new operations that would serve purposes I could not fathom. I found myself walking through the Fortress Monastery's detention level late one night, when the guards were minimal and the surveillance systems were cycling through their maintenance windows. I used access codes I had acquired through careful observation, codes that would not flag my presence to the security monitors, and made my way to the cells where the captured operatives were being held. They were in separate isolation units, denied any contact with each other or the outside world, waiting for formal interrogation by the Inquisitor's most skilled questioners. The first cell contained a man who looked exactly as I might look after weeks of brutal treatment. His face was a mass of bruises, his body carrying clear evidence of interrogation techniques that stopped just short of permanent damage. He looked up as I entered, and there was no surprise in his eyes, only a kind of weary recognition. He knew who I was, because he was who I was. We stared at each other across the cell in silence for a long moment, and I found myself wanting to ask him questions I knew he couldn't answer. Did he know why he had been sacrificed? Did he understand what purpose his suffering served? Did he regret the choices that had led him here, or had choice ever been a factor in his life? I asked him none of these things. Instead, I administered a compound that would stop his hearts and make it appear he had died from complications related to his injuries. It was a mercy, though I wasn't certain he would see it that way. The Inquisition's interrogators were skilled at extracting information, but they were even more skilled at inflicting suffering that could stretch for weeks or months. A quick death was preferable. The Legion would have prepared him to resist interrogation, but no amount of preparation could overcome the Inquisition's techniques indefinitely. Eventually, he would break. Eventually, he would reveal things he didn't even know he knew. Better to end it now, cleanly and painlessly. I did the same for the operative in the second cell. Though he fought the injection, seemed to understand what was happening and resist it with what little strength remained to him. His last words were a question I couldn't answer, a simple plea to know if any of it had mattered, if his service had meant anything at all. I told him yes because that was what he needed to hear, even though I had no idea if it was true. He died believing his sacrifice had purpose, and perhaps that was its own kind of mercy. I falsified the medical reports to indicate death from interrogation trauma, a not uncommon occurrence when dealing with enhanced individuals whose physiology responded unpredictably to standard questioning techniques. The Inquisitor was displeased by the loss of her prisoners but accepted the explanation without excessive scrutiny. The investigation continued, pivoting toward new leads that had been carefully seeded by operatives I would never meet, pursuing objectives I would never understand. I remained in my position for another 3 years, feeding information and shaping conclusions, watching as Inquisitor Varrock gradually assembled a picture of Alpha Legion operations in the sector that was simultaneously accurate and completely misleading. Every fact was true, every connection was verified, every conclusion was supported by evidence, and yet the overall picture was a masterwork of deception, a truth that concealed rather than revealed, that led the Inquisition into expending resources on targets that no longer mattered, while actual operations proceeded unimpeded in the shadows they had been trained not to see. The extraction came without warning, a sudden protocol activation that instructed me to cease all activities and proceed to a designated location for immediate departure. I burned my false identity in the literal sense, using chemical compounds to destroy the documents and devices that proved Kael Threx, the inquisitorial scribe, had ever existed. I walked out of the Fortress Monastery during a shift change when the corridors were crowded and attention was dispersed, becoming just another functionary moving through the daily churn of administrative personnel. By the time anyone thought to look for me, I would be gone, and the investigation into my disappearance would consume months before concluding that I had probably been an Alpha Legion operative all along. The pattern repeated across decades, new identities, new missions, new faces of myself that I encountered and sometimes killed. I served in the upper reaches of planetary governments and the lowest depths of underhive gangs. I fought alongside Imperial Guard regiments against Orc invasions and stood with cultist cells, preparing to summon entities from the warp. I sabotaged supply lines that fed Imperial war efforts and then protected those same supply lines from other saboteurs whose missions I could not determine. Every action contradicted some previous action. Every loyalty betrayed some previous loyalty. The accumulated weight of contradictions should have crushed me, should have broken whatever remained of my identity into fragments too small to sustain consciousness. But the Legion's training held. I compartmentalized. I adapted. I continued to function because functioning was all I knew how to do. The doubt grew quieter over time, or perhaps I simply learned to ignore it better. Purpose became irrelevant. Truth became irrelevant. There was only the mission, and the mission after that, and the mission that would follow until eventually a mission would demand my death, and I would give it willingly, because dying was simply another mission to be executed with professional competence. During one assignment on an agri-world called Harvest's End, I was tasked with infiltrating a local planetary defense force as a logistics officer. My mission was to ensure that certain weapons shipments were rerouted to specific regiments that were, according to my protocols, essential to maintaining regional stability. The work was tedious but straightforward, involving nothing more than altering shipping manifests and bribing a few key warehouse supervisors. I had been operating under this identity for almost 2 years when I received new protocols instructing me to sabotage the very same shipments I had been protecting. The contradiction was so stark, so immediate, that I found myself pausing before executing the new orders. For the first time in years, I questioned whether there had been an error in transmission, whether the protocols had been corrupted during transit through the warp. But the authentication codes were correct, the encryption was intact, the orders were legitimate. I was being instructed to undo 2 years of careful work, to destroy what I had built, to betray relationships I had cultivated specifically to support the original mission. I executed the new orders with the same precision I had applied to the original ones. I sabotaged the shipments, framed a rival logistics officer for the theft, and extracted myself from the situation before the investigation could gain momentum. But the experience left something festering in the back of my mind, a splinter of doubt that I couldn't fully excise. If the Legion could so casually reverse my objectives, if my work could be undone on apparent whim, then what had been the point of the original mission? Had circumstances changed so dramatically that what had been necessary 2 years ago was now counterproductive? Or had the original mission been deliberately designed to fail, its true purpose to establish credibility that could later be exploited through betrayal? I would never know. That was the entire point. The Legion's doctrine of enforced uncertainty meant that even asking these questions was ultimately futile. I was a component in a machine whose full design I could never perceive, executing subroutines whose contribution to the overall program would remain forever opaque. The best I could do was continue functioning until the machine no longer required my function. I was 68 years old when I killed my 5th version of myself. The mission took place on a shrine world called Purity's Light, where I had been operating as a junior ecclesiarch in one of the lesser cathedrals. My target was another Kael Threx, who had been posing as a pilgrim, someone whose mission had apparently diverged from acceptable parameters in ways I was not privy to. I found him in one of the cathedral's meditation gardens, kneeling before a statue of some obscure saint whose name I had never bothered to learn. He didn't resist when I approached, didn't try to flee or fight. He simply remained kneeling, his eyes closed, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or might have been a recitation of Legion protocols. I placed the barrel of my weapon against the base of his skull and waited, giving him time to finish whatever ritual he was performing. When he opened his eyes and nodded slightly, I pulled the trigger. His body fell forward onto the carefully manicured grass, blood pooling around the saint's stone feet in a pattern that looked almost deliberate. I searched his possessions and found another data slate, another collection of mission logs that detailed a life parallel to mine but subtly different in its particulars. This version of me had been more successful in several operations, had climbed higher in his cover identities, had accumulated more influence and resources. Reading his logs felt like encountering an alternate timeline where small differences in initial conditions had compounded into noticeably divergent outcomes. He had been more effective than me, more skilled, more valuable to the Legion's operations, and yet he was the one lying dead in the garden while I stood over him. Value was not protection. Effectiveness was not immunity. The Legion discarded its assets according to logics I could not fathom, and my survival to this point was no guarantee of continued survival. I could be the next target, eliminated by another Kale Threx who would read my logs and wonder at the minor variations between our experiences. I disposed of the body using a maintenance incinerator in the cathedral's lower levels, a device designed to burn the remains of failed servitors and malfunctioning equipment. The flames reduced him to ash and bone fragments that I scattered in the waste recycling system, ensuring that no physical evidence of his existence would remain. I forged documentation indicating that the pilgrim had completed his devotions and departed for the next shrine on his circuit, and no one questioned the discrepancy when he failed to arrive at his supposed destination. The incident should have been routine. I had killed versions of myself before, had disposed of their remains with professional efficiency, had filed the appropriate reports, and moved on to subsequent missions without lingering on what I had done. But this time something was different. This time I found myself returning to the meditation garden in the days that followed, standing where he had knelt, trying to understand what had motivated him to accept his termination so calmly. Had he reached some philosophical accommodation with the meaninglessness of our existence? Had he simply been too exhausted to resist? Or had he known something I didn't, possessed some insight that made death preferable to continued service? I spent hours searching through his data slate, analyzing every mission log, every operational note, every fragment of recorded thought, looking for some indication of what had been going through his mind in those final moments. I found nothing. His logs were identical in tone and substance to my own, displaying the same dry, factual reporting, the same careful avoidance of emotional investment, the same meticulous attention to operational security. If he had achieved any special understanding, he had not committed it to record. The lack of answers frustrated me in ways I had not experienced in decades. I had been trained to function without answers, to execute missions without understanding their purpose, to exist in a permanent state of strategic ambiguity. But this was different. This was personal in a way that cut through all my conditioning and compartmentalization. I had killed a man who was not just like me but was me in every meaningful sense, and I needed to know if he had found something in his death that might justify the absurdity of our shared existence. I began taking risks I knew were inappropriate for an operative of my experience. I lingered too long in compromising situations. I asked questions that drew unwanted attention. I cultivated relationships that served no operational purpose, seeking in conversation with others some reflection or insight that might illuminate the darkness at the center of my being. The other ecclesiarchs in the cathedral began to notice my distraction, commenting on my uncharacteristic abstraction during services and my tendency to lose focus during administrative meetings. The protocols arrived before my deterioration could progress to the point of operational compromise. I was being extracted and reassigned, sent to a facility for psychological reconditioning and neural resequencing. The message was clear without being explicitly stated. I had developed the kind of doubt that the Legion could not tolerate, the kind that threatened to metastasize into genuine questioning. I would be taken apart and rebuilt, my memories edited or erased, my personality adjusted to eliminate whatever flaw had allowed existential uncertainty to take root. I complied with the extraction order because compliance was all I knew. I traveled to the designated coordinates, reported to the faceless technicians who processed me through intake, submitted to the batteries of psychological evaluation that would determine exactly how much of me needed to be removed. Part of me hoped they would simply terminate me, that whatever they found in my psyche would be so contaminated that reconditioning was deemed impractical. but the evaluations concluded that I was salvageable, that the doubt had not yet spread beyond containable parameters, that I could be restored to operational effectiveness with minimal intervention. The reconditioning took 3 months, though my perception of time during the process was unreliable. They used a combination of psychic manipulation, pharmaceutical conditioning, and direct neural editing to excise the problematic thought patterns and reinforce the mental structures that enabled operational effectiveness. The procedure was not pleasant, but pain had long since ceased to have much meaning for me. What disturbed me more was the gradual erosion of memories I had carried for decades, the smoothing away of experiences that had defined my existence, however meaningless that existence might have been. When they released me back to active duty, I was lighter somehow, emptier in ways that I couldn't fully articulate. The memories of killing other versions of myself remained, but the emotional weight that had accompanied them was gone, filed away, or deleted entirely. I could recall the facts of those missions without the uncomfortable questions they had provoked, could remember standing in the meditation garden without the crushing sense of futility that had driven me to the edge of compromise. I had been debugged, my programming restored to factory specifications, ready to resume operations as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and even the reconditioning could not completely erase my awareness of it. There was a before and an after, a discontinuity in my existence that marked me as having been damaged and repaired. I was no longer quite the same Kale Threx who had entered the facility, no longer quite the seamless component I had been trained to be. The Legion had fixed me, but the fact that fixing had been necessary was itself a kind of permanent scarring. I was 73 years old when I received the final summons. The message was different from previous protocol activations, carrying an urgency I had never encountered before. I was to return to the training fortress immediately, abandoning whatever operation I was currently engaged in regardless of its importance or sensitivity. The fact that the message existed at all was significant. The Legion preferred to leave operatives in place until they were compromised or killed, extracting them only when absolutely necessary. Something had changed. Something had gone wrong or right in ways that required immediate response. The fortress had changed when I arrived. The geometry was subtly different, the corridors arranged in new configurations, the sounds carrying different tones and harmonics. Or perhaps it had always been this way and I was simply remembering it wrong, my accumulation of false memories finally overwhelming my ability to distinguish actual experience from implanted fiction. I was processed through security by servitors I did not recognize, then escorted to a chamber that definitely had not existed during my training years, a vast space that seemed to extend beyond what the fortress's external dimensions could contain. The chamber was filled with Kale Threxes. Hundreds of us, perhaps thousands, arranged in neat rows that stretched away into a distance that seemed to violate normal spatial logic. Every age, from young recruits barely out of training to ancient men who could only stand with assistance. Every variation of the pattern, every iteration of the template, gathered in one place for purposes I could not begin to guess. I found a position in one of the middle rows and waited with the rest, all of us silent, all of us maintaining the discipline that had been beaten into us across decades of service. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the chamber, and even at that distance, I could see that this was different from the instructors I had known. This was one of the Legion itself, an actual Astartes warrior clad in power armor the color of deep ocean water. He moved with the terrible grace of the transhuman, each step carrying more power than a normal man could generate in a full sprint. When he spoke, his voice filled the chamber without needing amplification, resonating in frequencies that touched something primal in the human hindbrain. He told us that the operation we had been serving was complete. Not any individual mission, but the larger strategic objective that our work had been contributing to across the centuries. He did not elaborate on what that objective had been, or whether its completion represented success or failure. Such information remained above our clearance level, he explained, remained beyond what we were permitted to know. What mattered was that our service was concluded. We had fulfilled our purpose, and the time had come for us to understand what that purpose had demanded. He explained that the Alpha Legion's greatest weapon was not secrecy but uncertainty. that the Imperium functioned on absolute belief, on unquestioning faith in the Emperor's divinity and the righteousness of humanity's cause. That such certainty made the Imperium powerful but also brittle, unable to adapt, unable to consider alternative approaches to the galaxy's endless threats. The Legion had spent 10,000 years introducing uncertainty into that system, forcing the Imperium to question its assumptions, to acknowledge that the universe was more complex than its dogma allowed. Every contradiction we had embodied, every betrayal we had executed, every seemingly pointless mission we had carried out, had served this larger purpose of maintaining flexibility in a civilization that desperately wanted to be rigid. He told us that we had been effective, that the Imperium remained capable of adapting to changing circumstances because the Legion had prevented it from calcifying entirely, that countless worlds had been saved by policies that might never have been implemented if not for the seeds of doubt we had planted across the centuries, that humanity's survival across 10,000 years of unending war was at least partly attributable to the work we had done in the shadows, forcing the Imperium to remain fluid even as it preached unchanging truth. He told us that none of this had required us to know what we were doing, that in fact our ignorance had been essential to the operation's success. If we had known the larger purpose, we might have shaped our actions toward that purpose, might have introduced our own biases and assumptions. Instead, we had executed our missions with perfect mechanical precision, becoming instruments that shaped events without understanding the music we were playing. We had been weapons that aimed themselves, and our effectiveness had depended on never knowing what we were shooting at. He told us that we would not be receiving new assignments, that our service was complete in the absolute sense, that the pattern we represented had been retired from active operations, replaced by new patterns better suited to the current strategic environment. We were, all of us in this chamber, obsolete. The galaxy had moved on. The Legion had moved on. We remained only as artifacts of an earlier phase of the Eternal War, components that had served their purpose and were now being discarded. He told us we had three choices. We could request immediate termination, a quick death that would honor our service and spare us the difficulty of learning to exist without purpose. We could request memory modification, having our Legion service erased from our minds and being released into the Imperium under new identities to live out whatever remained of our lives as ordinary citizens. Or we could request to be preserved in stasis, kept in suspension against the possibility that circumstances might change and our pattern might be needed again. The chamber remained silent as he finished speaking. No one asked questions. No one requested clarification. We had been trained not to ask questions, trained to accept the missions we were given without requiring them to make sense. This was simply our final mission, the last order we would receive as Alpha Legion operatives, to choose how we would end. I stood in that vast chamber, surrounded by thousands of iterations of myself, and I tried to feel something about what I had just been told. Relief that the service was over, satisfaction that it had mattered in some way, anger at having been used so completely, fear of whatever came next. But there was nothing. The machinery of my emotions had been dismantled piece by piece across decades of service, and what remained was simply a void where feelings should have been. I was empty. I had always been empty. The Legion had not created this emptiness, but rather had selected for it, had identified individuals who could be hollowed out and filled with purpose, and then had removed the purpose and left only the hollow. I requested preservation in stasis, not because I believed the pattern might be needed again, but because the alternative choices required making decisions about who I was and what I wanted, and I had no framework for those kinds of decisions. Identity was something I put on and took off like clothing. Desire was something I simulated when missions required it. I had no authentic self to consult, no inner voice that could tell me what ending I preferred. Stasis meant not having to figure out how to be a person. It meant remaining in suspension between purposes, waiting for an assignment that would probably never come. They processed us in groups, efficient and methodical, directing us toward different sections of the fortress according to our choices. The ones who chose termination were led away with dignity and respect, treated as honored veterans whose service entitled them to a clean ending. The ones who chose memory modification were taken to medical facilities where psychic surgeons would carefully excise decades of experience, leaving them with false histories that would explain the gaps. The ones like me, who chose stasis, were guided to vast storage chambers where thousands of suspension pods waited in neat rows. I watched as other versions of myself made their own choices, saw the distribution across the three options, noted that roughly equal numbers selected each path. It made sense in a statistical way. We were the same pattern, subjected to slightly different experiences, and those experiences had shaped us into slightly different end states. Some had retained enough sense of self to want to continue existing in some form, even if that form was stripped of all context and history. Some had accumulated enough damage or weariness that termination felt like a mercy. Some, like me, had simply stopped making real choices so long ago that defaulting to a state of indefinite suspension felt appropriate. As I was sealed into my pod, I found myself thinking about the instructor's explanation, about the claim that our service had mattered, that we had helped preserve the Imperium through our actions, even if we had never understood those actions. Part of me wanted to believe it, wanted to think that the sacrifices and compromises and betrayals had served some genuine purpose beyond the Legion's own perpetuation. But the training ran too deep. I had been conditioned to distrust certainty, to question every explanation, to recognize that truth was simply another tool to be manipulated by those with sufficient skill. Maybe we had saved the Imperium. Maybe we had been instrumental in its survival across 10 millennia of existential threats. Or maybe that was simply the story the Legion told us at the end, a comfortable lie to ease our transition into obsolescence, a final manipulation to ensure we went quietly into whatever darkness awaited us. I would never know. That uncertainty was the last gift the Legion gave me, the final demonstration that even in our ending, we remained true to the doctrine that had defined us. The technician who sealed my pod offered no words of comfort or acknowledgement. He was simply performing a task, cataloging another deprecated asset, ensuring that the storage system registered my preservation correctly. I was a unit in inventory now, a component warehoused against potential future need, no different from spare ammunition or archived data files. The transition from operative to object was seamless and appropriate. The stasis field activated with a sensation like falling backward into cold water. My consciousness began to fragment, thoughts slowing and stretching into meaningless patterns, awareness dissolving into something that was neither sleep nor waking nor anything I had words to describe. In those final moments before the darkness claimed me completely, I tried to formulate some kind of final thought, some summarizing statement that would capture what my existence had meant or what I had learned from it. Nothing came. There was nothing to say because there had never been anything worth saying. I had been a pattern in service to entropy, a component that had functioned until it no longer functioned, a question that had never required an answer because the question itself had been the point. The Legion had taught me to exist without meaning, and I had mastered that lesson so thoroughly that even my ending was meaningless. The cold claimed me completely, and I ceased to exist in any way that mattered, preserved but not living, suspended but not waiting, existing in the permanent void between states that the Legion had been preparing me for since the day they took me from whatever life I might have lived. I had given everything to the Alpha Legion, and in return, they had given me exactly what they had always promised, nothing at all.